You are in the water off Guadalcanal, and both of your hands have been cut through by a bayonet. Behind you, in the first gray light of morning, the men you came ashore with are being killed, and you can see the swords catching the sun. This was Sergeant Frank Few, 22 years old. A few hours earlier, his patrol had gone toward that beach on an armed reconnaissance, a mission also chasing a report that some of the Japanese there might be willing to surrender. Their colonel was dead within the hour. 3 men came back. What happened on that beach was never written as an order. No general commanded it, no manual described it. But the lesson those men died teaching would travel across 3 years and 6 islands of the worst fighting of the war, and it would take a single sheet of paper to begin to undo it. 6 days before Frank Few went into the water, the island had been silent. The Marines of the 1st Marine Division came ashore at Guadalcanal on the 7th of August, 1942, and almost nothing happened. No wall of fire on the beach, no enemy rising out of the trees to meet them. They pushed inland through the heat and the high grass and found a half-finished airfield. Cooking fires still warm, bowls of rice left where men had dropped them. The Japanese labor crews had melted into the jungle, and for a few strange days, the hardest things about Guadalcanal was a question nobody could answer. Where was the enemy? They would learn the answer slowly, and then, all at once. The wider Japanese war effort was shaped by a no-surrender ethos the Americans did not yet fully understand. In the Imperial Japanese Army, one formal expression of that ethos was a small printed booklet called the Senjin-kun. On the 8th of January 1941, Japan's War Minister, Hideki Tojo, had issued it to the entire army as its field code of conduct, and one-line incensuet would shape everything that happened on this island and on every island after. Do not live to suffer the shame of capture. Do not die leaving a name stained by dishonor. Every soldier carried a copy against his heart. Japan signed the 1929 Geneva Convention on Prisoners of War but did not ratify it. In 1942, however, the Japanese government stated that it would apply the convention's provisions with necessary modifications. And yet, in the culture those men had been raised in, to surrender was not a defeat. It was to stop being a man. The Americans had no such book. They had nothing written down at all. What they had instead, they were about to be taught on a beach in the dark. It began with a prisoner. In the second week of the fighting, a patrol brought in a Japanese warrant officer named Tsuneto Sakado. He was handed to the one man who could truly speak with him, Lieutenant Ralph Corey, a Marine who'd lived in Japan before the war and knew the language in his bones. Corey sat with him. At first, Sakado gave him nothing. Then Corey poured him brandy, and slowly the words began to come. West of the Matanakaw River, Sakado said, there was a body of Japanese troops. They had no leaders. They were sick. They were starving, and they might be ready to give themselves up. At almost false, other Marines came back with a report of their own. Out in the jungle west of the perimeter, they had seen something pale hanging in the trees. A white cloth. A flag. To the officer who ran the division's intelligence, those two things fit together into one hopeful picture. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Gachich was 46 years old, a large, experienced man who had given his whole life to the Marine Corps. He believed there were broken, hungry men out in that jungle who did not want to die, and that if someone went to them, lives could be saved on both sides. It was a decent thought. It was the thought of a decent man. It would kill almost everyone who followed him. Goich was not launching a planned assault. He was leading an armed reconnaissance patrol, one that also meant to investigate, and if the report proved true, to receive the surrender. He built the patrol around that possibility. He brought a surgeon, Navy Lieutenant Commander Malcolm Pratt, in case the starving men needed care. He brought Corey, the interpreter, so that someone could speak the words of surrender when the moment came. He brought his intelligence officers, Captain Wilfred Ringer and First Sergeant Stephen Custer, and to guard them, he brought hard, capable men, among them a 22-year-old sergeant from Buckeye, Arizona, named Frank Few. In all, about 25 Americans. They did not blacken their faces. They did not move like a war party. At dusk, they climbed into a boat to run an armed reconnaissance and to look into the report of Japanese troops who might give up. That is the first thing that is true about this story, and the first thing that is terrible. The men on that beach did not die in a planned assault. They died on an armed reconnaissance mission shaped in part by the hope that the reported surrender might be genuine. They shoved off from Kukum as the last light drained out of the sky on the 12th of August and moved west along a black coast. The boat ran aground on a sandbar short of the shore, and the engine had to grind in reverse to drag itself free, and the noise of it carried out across the water into the dark line of trees to whoever was waiting there in the silence. They went ashore anyway, near the mouth of the Matanakaw, and they formed up in the sand. The first burst of gunfire took Bitchki almost at once. The colonel who had come to save lives was dead in the opening minutes, and the surrender he had believed in did not exist. There was no ruined, starving unit waiting to lay down its arms. There was only a kill zone, and they had walked into the center of it. Corey, the interpreter, went down early, a bullet in his stomach, and lay in the sand for hours in agony, unable to move. Pratt, the surgeon, crawled toward a wounded man to help him and was shot through the chest and the back. The men who had come to heal were bleeding into the same sand as the men they had meant to save. And the white cloth in the trees, the pale flag that had promised surrender, it may never have been a surrender at all. It may have been a Japanese flag, a naval ensign, or the national colors, with the red sun disk folded back or hidden, so that from a distance, to tired and hopeful men, it read as a sign of peace. If it had been hung there to draw the patrol in, then it was no accident. It was a lie told in the language of mercy, and it had worked perfectly. Through the night, the patrol was pinned against the water and killed one man at a time. Sergeant Charles Arndt swam out first into the dark to try to bring help. Corporal Joseph Spaulding went after him. By the gray of morning, only a handful were still breathing, and Frank Few was one of them. A bayonet had been driven clean through both of his hands and his arm. He killed one man with a bayonet of his own. He clubbed a second with a jammed rifle. He took a pistol and shot a third. And then he turned and ran into the sea. He swam for the American lines, 4 miles of open water, and as he swam, he looked back at the beach he was leaving behind. In the first light of the day, he could see figures moving among the bodies of his friends. He could see the swords rising and falling. He could see them catching the sun. "I could see the swords flashing," he said, long afterward. That was all. That was enough. 25 men had gone to that beach on a reconnaissance mission that carried within it the hope of accepting a surrender. 3 of them came home. No bodies were ever recovered. There was nothing left to bring back and bury. By the time Few came through the wire with his ruined hands, the story was already moving through the division, faster than any order could travel. And the men who heard it drew a single silent conclusion. The survivors put it as plainly as it can be said. After this, no prisoners became an unspoken agreement. Not an order, an agreement. That difference would come to matter more than anyone yet understood. An order comes down from above. It can be signed, and it can be canceled. An agreement rises up from the men themselves out of what they have seen with their own eyes, and nothing written on paper can ever call it back. What died on that beach was not only 22 Americans. What also died was the willingness of many Marines on Guadalcanal to trust a Japanese surrender. And across the wider Pacific, similar distrust would grow from repeated real experience. Japanese refusal to surrender, from racial hostility, and from reciprocal brutality. 9 days later, that mistrust was confirmed in daylight in front of an entire division. Before dawn on the 21st of August, a Japanese colonel named Kiyonao Ichiki led more than 900 men in a charge across a narrow spit of sand at the mouth of a sluggish stream the Marines called Alligator Creek. Ichiki was so certain of victory that he had already written it into his diary before a shot was fired. But there was no cover on that sandbar and no way around it. He sent his men straight into machine guns that had been laid on that ground for days. By late afternoon, some 800 of them lay dead along the creek and the sand. Only a small number were taken alive. The battle was over, and then it started again. Marines moved out onto the sand to check the fallen, and the fallen sat up. Wounded men who had lain perfectly still opened fire at close shifty. Others waited, a grenade held tight against the body, until a Marine bent down to look and then pulled the pin, killing themselves and the man leaning over them in the same instant. One wounded Japanese officer shot a Marine who had come to examine him and was killed in turn by another Marine. Men who had lived through the entire night were dying at dawn, killed by bodies they had already walked past. The division's commander, Major General Alexander Van de Grift, 55 years old, a Marine his whole adult life, sat down and wrote a letter to the Commandant of the Marine Corps, Lieutenant General Thomas Holcomb. He wrote like a man describing something he had no language for. "I have never heard or read of this kind of fighting," he wrote. "These people refuse to surrender. The wounded will wait until men come up to examine them and blow themselves and the other fellow to pieces with a hand grenade." Then he gestured at the conclusion and left it unwritten, as though the answer were too plain to need saying. He did not have to write it. The answer had already been written 9 days earlier on a beach west of the Matanakau by 22 men who never came back. What had been a secret carried by 3 survivors was now the shared knowledge of every Marine on the island. The wounded were weapons. The dying were weapons. The dead had to be made certain before you ever turned your back. And somewhere in that division was Frank Few, 22 years old, his hands wrapped and useless, alive only because he had swum 4 miles of open sea while his friends were cut to pieces behind him. No one had handed him an order. They had handed him a lesson. And in the 3 years of war still ahead of him, across island after island after island, that lesson would travel with the Marines wherever they landed, needing no signature, no command, no single sheet of paper to make it real. It would need only one thing. The men who learned it would have to live long enough to teach it to the men who came next. The pattern that was born on Guadalcanal did not stay there. It traveled the way the men themselves traveled, from island to island, ocean to ocean, deeper into the war. And on each new beach it grew colder and harder and more certain. What follows is that journey, 4 islands. 4 times the same lesson was written again, larger each time in the blood of both sides. Begin with a number. In November of 1943, 15 months after Few came out of the water off Guadalcanal, the 2nd Marine Division came for a coral island called Badio in the Tarawa Atoll. It was a scrap of land barely 10 feet above the sea, not much longer than an airfield. The Japanese had turned every inch of it into a machine. More than 500 defensive positions, pillboxes, bunkers, and gun emplacements, linked by covered trenches, aimed at the water. The garrison was around 4,500 men, and their commander, Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, had told them what he believed, that 1 million men could not take Tarawa in 100 years. He was wrong about the time. He was not wrong about the price. The killing began before the Marines ever reached the sand. A reef ringed the island, and the landing boats caught on it hundreds of yards out in chest-deep water with no cover of any kind. The men climbed over the sides, and they waded in, waist-deep, then chest-deep, then waist-deep again, across 500 yards of open water into guns that had been sighted on that exact ground for months. The lucky ones reached the low sea wall because the men ahead of them had drawn the fire and gone down, absorbing it. That is not a figure of speech. On Badio, you lived by walking forward over the men who had not. It lasted 76 hours, 3 days and 4 hours. When it ended, more than 1,000 Marines were dead, and another 2,000 were wounded, and in 76 hours, that single division had lost more men killed than the entire 1st Marine Division had lost in 6 months on Guadalcanal. And out of a garrison of 4,500 Japanese soldiers, the number who surrendered was 17. Say that number slowly, because a percentage will lie to you. A percentage rounds it off, softens it, files it next to other percentages, and lets you move on. 17 is not a percentage. 17 is a head count. You can picture 17 men. You could fit them in one room. 17 men out of 4,500 chose to live. And even that number tells a lie of its own, because most of those 17 were not found walking toward the Marines with their hands raised. They were found unconscious, too badly wounded to move, too concussed to make the choice their code demanded of them. The number of men on Badio who looked at the guns and looked at the leaflets and made a clear, deliberate decision to lay down their weapons and live was, supposed to counts, close to 0. There were also around 130 Korean laborers taken alive, men the Japanese had shipped in to dig, who had no oath to die for and no reason to. They were not counted among the 17. The distinction matters. In this ocean, by the end of 1943, being found alive and choosing to live had become two entirely different things. The Marines who waited on Tabatio already expected determined Japanese resistance because the wider Pacific War had shown, again and again, how rarely Japanese troops surrendered. The destruction of the Getch Patrol had been one early warning of that, not the single source of it. They came ashore, expecting the wounded to be armed, the dying to be dangerous, the dead to require one more round to be sure. And Tarawa did not correct them. Tarawa confirmed them in numbers so stark that the whole grim machine finally became visible as a machine. Two doctrines, one printed in a booklet, one whispered across a wire in the dark, had locked together and begun to feed on each other. And they were still hungry. The next island would prove just how hungry, because on the next island, the machine reached past the soldiers entirely. In June of 1944, American forces landed on Saipan in the Mariana Islands. Saipan differed from Tarawa and the earlier island battles because it held a large civilian population alongside the garrison saying. Japanese settlers, Korean workers, and native Chamorros who had lived under Japanese rule since before most of these Marines were born. Farmers, fishermen, schoolteachers, children. For the first time in the Central Pacific Drive, American forces had entered a major Japanese-administered center, and for weeks its residents had been fed intense warnings and propaganda about what the Americans would do when they came. They were not prepared to surrender. They were prepared to die. The leaflets and the loudspeakers told them the Americans would torture them, would violate women, would eat their children. That capture was worse than any death. On the 7th of July, near the northern end of the island, came the largest banzai charge of the entire Pacific War. More than 3,000 Japanese soldiers, many of them already wounded, some barely able to walk, threw themselves at the American line before dawn and nearly destroyed 2 battalions of the Army's 105th Infantry Regiment. Among the dead was a battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel William O'Brien, 44 years old, who had stood and fought until he was overrun. The charge changed nothing about the outcome of the battle. It was never meant to. It was the code, spending the last of its soldiers all at once. But the soldiers were not the last of it. And what happened during the final phase of the fighting is the thing that some of the men who saw it would never speak of again. At the northern tip of Saipan, at a place called Marpi Point, the limestone cliffs fall sheer to the rocks and the surf. There is no beach at the bottom, only stone and the sea. As American forces closed on Marpi Point in the last days of the battle, before and around the island's declaration as secure on the 9th of July, hundreds of civilians gathered near the northern cliffs. They went over them, whole families, together. Mothers held their children above the water until their own strength gave out. Men gathered their families close and pulled the pins on grenades, and a Japanese soldier, positioned on the cliff face, shot at the ones who hesitated. The ones who turned back toward the American lines, the ones who had begun, perhaps, to weigh the propaganda against the men they could now see below them on the shores. American soldiers holding out food, holding out water, calling up to them in Japanese to please come down. The code had been written for soldiers. No one had ever handed the Senjin-kun to a fisherman's wife on Saipan. She had never read it. She did not have to. It had been in the air she breathed for 20 years, in every broadcast and every classroom and every official word about what an American was and what surrender meant, until it lived inside her as deeply as if she had sworn the oath herself. And it walked her and her children to the edge of a cliff with no officer ordering it and no document to command it. That is the horror of Saipan. But it is not the whole truth of Saipan, and this story means to tell all of it. Because on that same shoreline, on one of those same afternoons, an American Marine was photographed sitting in the dirt at the side of a road. He was filthy with the grime of the fighting. There was blood on his face that was not his own. And he was holding a Japanese child, a little girl, perhaps 6 years old, whom he had carried up from the rocks below. He had gone down and brought her out, and on that grime-streaked, blood-marked face, there were tears, the same war, the same beach, the same afternoon. The code that had told 2 million soldiers how to die had never been written for that little girl. and a Marine who had every reason, by everything the last 2 years had taught him, to trust nothing and no one, had climbed down and carried her back up into the light. Both of those things are true. Neither one cancels the other. And a man who wants to understand this war has to be willing to hold them both in the same hand. By September, the machine had a new refinement to teach, and a 20-year-old mortarman from Mobile, Alabama, was there to write it down. His name was Eugene Sledge, and he had come ashore on Peleliu on the 15th of September, 1844, with a pocket Bible and a stubbed of pencil, making notes in the jeans, notes that would one day become the most honest account of the Pacific War an ordinary Marine ever set down. Peleliu was supposed to take 4 days. It took 73. The Japanese commander there, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, 46 years old, had studied the failures of Guadalcanal and Tarawa and drawn the correct conclusion. No more banzai charges into the open. Instead, he had spent months turning a coral ridge called the Umabrogol into a fortress of some 500 caves and tunnels, each one covering the others, so that a man could not advance on one without being fired on from 3 more. The coral held the heat until the ground temperature reached 115 degrees. There was no shade. There was almost no water. And into that furnace, for 2.5 months, the Marines went cave by cave. Across Peleliu and the neighboring islands of Angkor and Gesispus, American forces suffered about 9,600 casualties. On Peleliu itself, the 1st Marine Division that bore the worst of it lost 6,526 men, including its Navy medical personnel. Of 11,000 Japanese defenders, 202 were taken alive, and of those 202, only 19 were Japanese soldiers. The rest were laborers, largely Korean, brought there to work, men who were never counted as Japanese military personnel. 19 out of 11,000, and Sledge watched a battle in which nearly the whole Japanese garrison was killed rather than captured, and he refused to look away from what that fighting did to the men around him, or to dress it up. He wrote, in his own plain words, that they simply did not take prisoners, that when a Japanese soldier did try to give up, he too often had a grenade waiting, so that surrender itself had become another kind of ambush. And so, after a position was taken, the Marines would fire again into the enemy dead and the enemy wounded alike to be certain, before they moved on, that certain was the only safe thing to be. What had begun on Guadalcanal as one division's shocked reaction to one night of treachery had become, on Peleliu, a routine, a procedure, something you did without being told, because the men who did not do it did not come home. And Sledge, to his lasting credit, would not pretend it was all cold tactical necessity. He named the other thing he saw in himself and in the men beside him, a hatred so deep and so primitive that it turned the fighting savage in a way he had no other word for. He did not excuse it, he did not explain it away, he simply testified to it so that no one who came after could say they had not been told. It is worth stopping here on Peleliu to correct a picture that many Americans think they know. A few months before this battle, a magazine had photographed that would be used for the next 80 years as proof of American savagery. A young woman at a desk writing a letter, and on the desk in front of her a human skull said to be a Japanese soldier's, sent home to her by her sweetheart in the Pacific. It ran as the picture of the week, and in 2025, the woman's own family finally said what the picture had never admitted, that it had been staged, a posed shoot, that she had never had a sweetheart in the Pacific at all. Where the skull came from, no one can now say. But here is the harder truth, and the one that matters. The staging of that one photograph does not erase what it stood for. The taking of trophies from the enemy dead in the Pacific was real. It was common enough that the Army's own top lawyer, in a memo dated the 13th of June, 1944, 3 months before Peleliu, called the mutilation of enemy dead repugnant, a violation of the Geneva Convention, a thing that could in theory carry the death penalty. The government saw it, the government named it, and the memorandum did more than admit the problem. It recommended that commanders issue a directive prohibiting the mutilation and misuse of enemy remains, and it followed earlier Army and Navy orders against the same thing. Yet enforcement was uneven, and prosecutions almost never came, not through Peleliu, not through the islands still ahead, not to the end of the war. And on the next island, that loose thing would reach the one man every war in history had agreed to protect above all others. On Iwo Jima, the Japanese learned one word of English. Not a threat, not a taunt. The one word on any battlefield that was supposed to mean safety. The word written into the laws of war. The word that for generations had meant this man has come to save a life, not take one. Corpsman. They screamed it in English from the caves and the shell holes torn into the black volcanic rock, and the Navy medics, doing the only job they had, came running and were shot. The men who landed there on the 19th of February 1945 faced more than 20,000 Japanese under General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, 53 years old, who had learned every lesson the earlier islands taught and built the deadliest defenses of the war. 18 kilometers of tunnels beneath the rock, 1,500 rooms and passages and firing positions, so that ground the Marines cleared in the morning filled again from below by afternoon, and the dead could not be trusted to stay dead, and a voice could cry corpsman in perfect English from a hole 50 yards behind the line. The corpsmen began tearing the Red Cross markings off their uniforms because the markings had become a target. One of them, a pharmacist's mate named Stanley Dabrowski, said afterward that they had been told to carry sidearms, not to attack with, but simply to stay alive, and he had hated it because it meant that the men whose whole reason for being there was to heal had become the enemy's first choice to kill. On Iwo Jima, more than 300 corpsmen were killed and hundreds more wounded. In some battalions, half of them were hit. The single word that the entire civilized world had agreed would never be a weapon had been turned into one of the deadliest on the island. And still the medics ran toward it. A pharmacist mate named John Willis, 23 years old, was treating a wounded Marine in a shell hole when the grenades began landing beside him. He picked one up and threw it back. Then another. He threw back 8 of them, one after another, before the 9th went up in his hand and killed him. A boy of 17 named Jack Lucas, who had lied about his age to enlist and then stowed away on a ship because they told him he was too young to go, threw himself down onto 2 grenades to cover them within his bodysuit, and somehow carrying more than 200 fragments of steel ants inside him for the rest of his life. These were not legends. They were young men, most of them barely out of boyhood, doing the specific terrible arithmetic of that island, where saving a life often meant spending your own. Another of them, a pharmacist's mate named John Bradley, treated the wounded under fire on Iwo Jima and was decorated for it, and then went home to Wisconsin and opened a funeral parlor and did not speak of that island. Not to his neighbors, not to his wife, not to his children. For 50 years he carried what the word corpsman had come to mean on that black volcanic rock, and he never once put it into a sentence that anyone else was allowed to hear. Some men brought the war home in their bodies. Bradley brought it home in his silence and kept it there until he died. Of more than 20,000 Japanese on Iwo Jima, around 216 were taken alive, most of them found unconscious or too broken to resist. The number who stood up whole and walked toward the American line with open eyes and open hands was smaller still. 3 years now since a bayonet went through Frank Few's hands on a beach west of the Matanakau. 3 years since a white cloth hung in the trees and turned out to be a lie. And in those 3 years, the distrust that needed no order and no signature had hardened from one patrol to one division to one ocean, and it had ground its way down through the rank of the enemy dead until it had reached the medic, the healer, the last protected man on the field. It had inverted the deepest rule of war. It had made the act of mercy into a fatal risk, and the word for help into bait. When a war has gone that far, the question is no longer whose fault it is or what document is to blame. There is no document. There never was. The question is whether anything on this earth can reach far enough down into that machine to slow it, even a little, before it consumes what is left. And the answer, when it finally came, would not come from a general or an order or a gun. It would come from a single sheet of paper. The paper was small. It fit in a man's hand, and it was designed to do something no order in 3 years of war had managed to do. It was designed to make 2 enemies, at the same moment, decide not to kill each other. By the spring of 1945, the men whose job was words rather than rifles had studied the machine, and they had found something the riflemen never could. They had found that the barrier ran in both directions. On the Japanese side, the barrier was in the language itself. The words a leaflet would normally use for surrender, kosen, kofuku, were so heavy with shame that no Japanese soldier could read them and keep his self-respect. To surrender, in those words, was not simply to lose. It was to stop being a man of honor, to become nothing, to erase your own name. And every soldier already knew, from 3 years of Guadalcanal and Tarawa and Peleliu and Iwo Jima, exactly what waited for the man who tried to cross that line. So the words themselves were a wall. You could not ask a Japanese soldier to do a thing the very sounds of which meant disgrace. But the wall on the American side was just as high, and it had been built by everything this story has already told. A Marine on Okinawa, where American forces landed on the 1st of April 1945, had been taught by 3 years of hard evidence to shoot first and to trust nothing. A man coming out of a cave with his hands in the air was, by the arithmetic of the Pacific, about as likely to be genuine as a white cloth hanging in the trees on Guadalcanal in August of 1942. The Marine remembered, even if he had never heard the name, what that white cloth had done to the men who trusted it. So he did not lower his rifle, and the Japanese soldier, watching him not lower it, saw every reason to die where he stood instead of trying. The men who designed the paper understood that they had to break both walls all at once, or neither would fall. So they did not use the shameful words. Working with Japanese prisoners who told them what a soldier could and could not survive being asked to do, they built a new phrase. Teiko o yamamasu. I cease resistance, not a surrender, not disgrace. Simply the laying down of the fight. It was engineered carefully to weigh less on a man's honor, light enough that in the last extremity he might just be able to lift it. And they printed instructions with it, and the instructions were a kind of quiet genius because they were written for the American as much as for the Japanese. Stripped to the waist, the leaflet said, so no grenade can be hidden. Hold this paper high on a stick above your head. Walk slowly toward the American line. Every one of those steps did two things at once. It told the Japanese soldier how to live, and it told the American watching him that this man had followed a recognizable procedure designed to reduce the risk of concealed weapons, though no set of movements could ever make a false surrender impossible. The paper was not only a message, it was a set of motions choreographed to be trusted. And then there was one more detail, and it is the detail that closes the circle of this entire story. Printed large on that leaflet, in English, were 2 words meant for American eyes. I surrender. A psychological warfare or analyst who later studied the campaign put it plainly. There was good reason to believe the headquarters wanted those English printed big so that the American soldier would see them and hold his fire. Read that again and let it land. 3 years after a beach on Guadalcanal taught the Marines never to trust a surrender, the answer the United States reached for was a piece of paper whose real job, in part, was to stop a Marine from shooting. There had never been an order telling him to shoot. There had never been a prosecution when he did. The judge advocate had called the mutilation of the dead repugnant a year before on paper, and little had come of it. And so the institution's answer, when it came, was not a command and not a punishment. It was a printed word, in 2 languages, saying the same thing to both sides at once. Stop. Before and during the Okinawa campaign, the Psychological Warfare Branch prepared nearly 6 million illustrated leaflets, built around about 25 different themes, to be delivered by aircraft and by artillery shell. The wider psychological warfare effort did help produce more surrenders on Okinawa. But it was only one factor among several. The collapse of Japanese resistance, appeals recorded by prisoners themselves, locally mobilized Okinawans, who had never shared the regular soldiers' indoctrination, and morale that was failing on its own. Wartime summaries set an earlier prisoner rate of roughly 1% against about 11% on Okinawa. But that Kanavia figure count Japanese soldiers, locally mobilized Okinawans, laborers, and men taken under every kind of circumstance, not only soldiers who had been talked into walking out. About 11,000 Japanese and Okinawan military personnel were captured or surrendered during the campaign, including thousands of unarmed laborers and mobilized Okinawans. Not all of them came out because of a leaflet, but honesty defends the other half of that number. 11 or 12 out of 100 means 88 or 89 out of 100 still did not. Some 90,000 Japanese on Okinawa did not walk toward the line with a leaflet on a stick. On Okinawa, soldiers still fired on stretcher teams. In the limestone caves, civilians still held 2 grenades, one for the enemy and one for the family. Mothers in the dark still made the choice. The code had left them. The machine had been slowed. It had not been stopped. A single sheet of paper could bend the thing that 3 years of blood had forged. It could not break it. And so we come to the last image, the one this whole story has been walking toward, all the way from a white cloth in the trees. A Marine Corps photograph released on the 25th of July, 1945, on an Okinawa the Americans had already declared secure weeks before, showed a Marine standing in the open. Not behind cover, not at the lip of a trench. In the open, the most exposed a man can be on a battlefield, with one arm raised, signaling his own squad to hold their fire. And in front of him, emerging from a cave, was a wounded Japanese soldier with his hands up, coming out. The surviving caption tells us after smoke had been used